Now, what do I mean when I say weirdest abilities? Well, abilities from WoW's history that had unconventional effects or just did non-combat related things that I found interesting. At number 10, we've got Shadow Word Insanity. This was a very short-lived, talented spell for Shadow Priest in the early days of Mist of Pandaria that had a really weird and unique effect. You see, what this spell did was remove one of your dots from the target to just do a ton of single target damage. But within certain restrictions, it only worked on Shadow Word Pain, which was just one of 3 shadow dots at the time, and it could only be used when the dot had less than 6 seconds left on its duration. And at the time, Shadow Word Pain lasted 18 seconds. So you had to wait for the dot to go through 2/3 of its duration before even being able to use Shadow Word Insanity. And on top of that, the spell removed your dot. You don't want to remove your dots as a Shadow Priest. Dots at the time, and throughout nearly all of a Shadow Priest's lifespan, were their bread and butter. There were no benefits to removing your dot early with Insanity, and in fact, only negatives, as you then had to reapply the dot immediately after, because you didn't want your target to not have all your dots up at all time. This led to some of the most skilled players waiting until the dot was under 3 seconds in duration, so as to only clip the last tick of the dot, instead of the last 2 ticks at 6 seconds, allowing for a little bit more DPS from the talent, and just needlessly making the rotation more difficult for no reason. It's pretty obvious to see why Shadow Word Insanity was such a short-lived ability. Rather than try to improve the ability a little bit to maybe, I don't know, reapply the dot after it was used, they just replaced it with something else and abandoned the idea altogether. At number 9, we've actually got a Hunter Pet ability. You see, back in Vanilla WoW, Hunter Pets had all kinds of hidden special abilities in addition to their normal in-game stated abilities. So hunters would go out and tame all kinds of random beasts to see if they had some kind of special ability, and many did. It's just not all of them were very useful, and some were downright bad, or even harmful, like in the case of the Tall Strider, Mazzranache. Maz had the unique special ability of being able to run slower than walking speed. It also had the unique distinction of being one of the only pink Tall Striders in game at the time. So while other pets had extra magical resistances, spells, or super fast attack speeds, Maz could run slower than them all. That is to say, it did not have a very useful special ability. Eventually in Vanilla, Blizzard went in and normalized run speeds for pets, and Maz was just turned into a unique color Tall Strider you could get, which actually did make him kind of sought after for people who wanted Tall Strider pets. At number 8, we've got Distract. Of all the abilities that will be on this list, Distract is probably the only one still in game. Now, Distract is a really unique ability. It can only be used in stealth, it can only be used on targets out of combat, and it doesn't have any kind of CC potential or damage relevance. So why has it stayed in the game for so long? And even more importantly, why is it still so heavily used? Well, while it may not technically CC anything, it does turn mobs around, which makes them a tiny bit easier to sneak past in raids or dungeons or out in the open world. It also forces mobs to stop, so it can be used to control patrolling mobs more easier, so they don't accidentally wander into your fight, or if you just want to go past them with little trouble. In the past, Distract could also be used to only stop the guards from patrolling mobs if used very precisely, and allow you to pick out some of the stronger mobs from the pack of them. That way you don't have to deal with them all at once. But nowadays, the whole patrolling pack will stop if even one of them does, so you can't use Distract to split them up anymore. It also has some situational PvP uses as well. You see, Distract will face enemy players in the direction of Distract as well. But since they're controlled by a real person, they'll just immediately turn back into the direction they were originally going anyway. Or just turn around whichever way they want, because they're not AIs programmed to stand still if you're being Distract. They're players who can just move on their own. So its only real uses are to maybe use it on a player who's just a tad too close to a cliff to have them turn and run off of it if they don't correct themselves fast enough. To turn players around who are casting spells and who are not in combat yet backwards so the spell doesn't finish casting. Or to just mess with players and let them know that a rogue is nearby by turning them around randomly. Or to even turn them towards you so they get in range for a sap easier. So, like I said, it's a weird, unique ability that technically doesn't do any damage, buff, or CC, but its situational usefulness is actually pretty useful and widely used. So it's managed to stay in the game all these years while similar abilities have been cut. Number 7. Vanilla WoW Spell/Firestones. Spellstones and Firestones were a thing Warlocks used to have that basically just gave them a buff they could put on their weapon. The buff was usually standard stuff like more X number to Y stat things. But in Vanilla WoW, the Spellstones were actually offhand weapons you had to equip. So you lost all of the stats of that offhand you used to replace it, and couldn't use them with two-handed weapons. Imagine, for example, if warriors had to equip a created item to get a buff that increased their healing. That's kind of what Spellstones were to warlocks. The Firestone in particular was very baffling. You see, what the Firestone did was add extra fire damage to your melee attacks on hit, which honestly wouldn't be half bad if it weren't for the fact that warlocks don't use melee attacks and are in fact spellcasters. To be fair, it did also increase your fire damage by a little bit, and warlocks did have a lot of fire spells. But the extra fire damage on melee attacks was pretty out of place. Eventually, the stones were changed to be equipped in the wand slot, because back in the day, your ranged weapon could be equipped alongside melee weapons, and that was actually not as terrible for warlocks as having to equip it in the offhand slot, but still pretty bad, as it did still replace an item to use. Then, it was later reasonably changed to just an enchant you could apply to your weapon, like Rogue Poisons or the Shaman Magical Weapon enchants, and was much more useful. But the vanilla version of these stones was just weird. Number 6, Sentry Totem. This totem just allowed you to look through the eyes of the totem if you clicked on it. Its practical uses included maybe putting it in key spots in battlegrounds to periodically check to see if the enemy was coming, and to allow you to take screenshots of your character or guild for boss kills. That is to say, not very useful, and that's kind of why it was removed. It was more of a fun ability to play around with, like Eye of Kilrog or Farsight, and since shamans already have Farsight, I guess, Blizzard didn't want them to have two fun abilities and removed it. Or maybe because the mechanic of using it was honestly pretty clunky. Who knows, but one thing is for sure, it counts as a weird ability, but would also be neat if it returned in some form. Number 5, Amplify Magic and Dampen Magic. Amplify Magic in its original form was a buff a mage could cast on himself and other raid members to both increase the magic damage they took, as well as increase the healing they received. In essence, amplifying the amount of magic they took. The increased healing effect was nice, but because it also increased the damage, you couldn't actually use it very often. There are tons of bosses and mobs in games that use magic damage, so it wasn't worth using if there was any kind of magic damage on the fight. But if you could be sure it was all physical damage going out, and there were fights like that, you could then give your raid a nice little healing buff. Same in PvP. If you could be sure your opponent didn't have any magic damage, like facing off against double warriors or something, you could get a little bit of extra healing. It certainly had its uses, but they were very limited, and most mages forgot they even had the ability when it was still around, since it wasn't useful more often than not. In Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard brought back the spell as a raid-wide 6-second buff that just increased the healing everyone took by 10%, before being removed 2 patches into that expansion, along with all other DPS raid-wide buffs, like Aspect of the Fox. Not because the spell's bad or anything, but because Blizzard didn't like the idea of DPS players having to give the raid a utility cooldown or whatever, I don't know. Dampen Magic did the exact opposite thing of Amplify Magic, and reduced all magic damage you took, as well as reducing your healing received, which also wasn't very useful unless you didn't have a healer in your group and were soloing stuff or something. You really didn't want to lower the healing you received. The most used feature of Dampen Magic was just to use its rank 1 version in PvP, so that it could act as a purge shield. Number 4, Shadow of Death. Imagine a shaman's reincarnation ability, except a passive that always goes off, but turns you into a ghoul with a separate action bar. That's what Shadow of Death was. Shadow of Death was an unholy Death Knight talent in early Wrath of the Lich King that would instantly bring you back to life as a ghoul when you died for 45 seconds, and could be used in arenas. It should go without saying that DKs were really good in PvP when this was a thing. Although they were all kinds of broken when this talent was still in the game, so coming back to life on top of being really hard to take down was more of a slap in the face than anything. When Blizzard tried to bring early Wrath Death Knights down to the level of normal characters and nerfed a ton of their overpowered abilities, this talent was also removed in that process. Which is sad because it seems like a fun little weird gimmick. After dying, you just come back to life for a bit as a ghoul to do some mediocre damage. Kinda like how holy priests get to turn into a guardian spirit and heal for a bit after dying. Although, to be fair, I can also think of a ton of ways to exploit the ability if it ever did come back, like using a ghoul DK to soak a hard-hitting raid mechanic or something similar to that. Number 3, MindSoothe. MindSoothe was actually a pretty useful spell, I think. What it did was allow you to put a debuff on a mob that was out of combat, and it would lower their aggro radius, which made it easier for your group to sneak past pack of mobs. A spell that would be very useful in Mythic Plus dungeons today, as it could be cast on multiple targets as well. Only here's the twist. It only worked on humanoids, and later on also dragonkins, which meant it wasn't used very often, like Distract, which could be used on any targets. Also, it could be resisted, and if it was resisted, that counted as an aggressive act and put you in combat. If they just made it usable on everything, or at the very least just like all non-mechanical targets, I think they could bring it back. Every time I have to skip packs of mobs in dungeons or raids, I miss having the ability, as it would make that a little bit easier. But it was super niche, and that was basically its only use, and most priests forgot they even had it since it had that whole target restriction thing. Number 2, Divine Intervention. This ability was pretty straightforward, just really unique as there's nothing else like it in game. What it did was allow the paladin to kill themselves to place an unbreakable bubble on another raid member. This bubble lasted about 3 minutes, made them immune to all damage, and took them out of combat. It was one of the best wipe recovery abilities in the game, as you could just use it on a healer if you knew that attempt was going to be a wipe. to get back in quicker, and to avoid repair bills, as the paladin didn't take death durability loss when using it, and obviously the person you used it on wouldn't die, so they avoided a repair bill too. It was a wholly unique ability that was very useful for a niche, non-combat purpose. So why was it removed? Well, because of exploits. Whenever Blizzard designed a raid fight, they had to keep in mind whether or not Divine Intervention could be used to break a part of the encounter. And the fact that they had to even keep that ability in mind like that while designing raid fights was in of itself a problem. Off the top of my head, I know it could be used in ICC to remove Rune of Blood from tanks on the Sourfang fight, which just trivialized a major raid mechanic. Technically, they brought the ability in name for Legion as a Retribution Paladin talent, but it functions nothing like its original namesake. All it does is reduce the cooldown on Divine Shield and work like Cheat Death, in that it prevents a killing blow, heals you back up to 20% health, and then activates your Divine Shield ability. I mean, that is a pretty useful, life-saving ability, but it's not anything like the raid wipe recovery ability it used to be. And finally, number 1. The number 1 weird and or unique ability in WoW's history. An ability so weird, clunky, and unique that Blizzard didn't even want to try balancing it anymore, and just removed it after the expansion that introduced it. In fact, it had the same problems as Divine Intervention, in that Blizzard had to design fights with this ability in mind to make sure it couldn't be exploited. And that ability, of course, is the Druid ability Symbiosis. Now, how to explain Symbiosis? So, basically, every class in the game was given an extra ability called Symbiosis, except you couldn't actually use it unless a druid casted Symbiosis on you. Once they did, you gained that ability to use, which was different for every single spec in the game. And the druid gained a new ability based on the class they casted the ability on, and which spec they were in when they used the ability. All in all, druids had 40 different spells they could use with this method, each one being a special druid version of the class it used the Symbiosis on. I think this will be a little easier to explain if I just give some examples. Let's take druids using Symbiosis on shamans, which was a pretty popular choice for resto druids to use it on. If the druid was in balanced spec, they'd gain the ability to use Purge from the shaman, an ability that just removed one magic effect from the enemy target. Feral druids gained the Feral Spirit ability, or Ghost Wolves as they're more widely known as, which was basically exactly the same thing as the enhanced shaman cooldown of summoning 2 ghost wolves to fight for you for 30 seconds. Guardian druids would gain the ability Lightning Shield, which just did a little bit of lightning damage back to the attackers on hit, which seems like an ability a tank spec could make use of. And resto druids would gain the ability Spirit Walker's Grace, which allowed the druid to cast spells while moving, and was more widely used to cast Tranquility while on the move, a long duration channel raid-wide healing ability. Now for the shaman abilities, elemental and enhanced shamans would gain the Solar Beam ability, which is just an AoE silence that balanced druids can use. And resto shamans, strangely enough, gained the Prowl ability, which allowed them to stealth while in ghost wolf form. The abilities the druid gave the other classes were not as diverse as the abilities the druid obtained. Like mages, for example, all 3 specs just gained the Healing Touch ability, and all 3 specs of warlocks just got the Rejuvenation ability. The ability could also be used in PvP, and gave all kinds of PvP related abilities as well, meaning PvPers had to memorize all of the combinations of Symbiosis, or else be taken by surprise by a random stealth shaman, or a priest using Cyclone to CC. Symbiosis was also just straight up better for some classes than others, like how Shadow Priest got the Tranquility ability from it, essentially giving a DPS a good raid-wide emergency heal. Or how Symbiosis gave most of the tanks really good defensive cooldowns, which could be used in conjunction with all of their other defensive cooldowns. Same with the druids on their end. Some druids would only ever use the spell on raid members that had an ability that they really wanted. Like the Resto druid in our raid team would only ever use it on the shaman to use Spirit Walker's Grace, and the tank druid would only ever use it on the DK to gain Bone Shield. The ability, while wholly fun and unique, was just too much to balance around. Plus, Blizzard had to create brand new abilities for these Symbiosis spells. I imagine Blizzard didn't want to have to balance around 70 different spells for just one ability that only one class could use, and so just removed it to no longer have to deal with that headache. Which, I mean, I can't blame them. It was fun while it lasted, but the spell was too ambitious for its own good. And that's the end of the video. Any other weird abilities in WoW's history that I may have missed, or maybe you just don't like the ones I chose? I generally read all the comments even if I don't reply to them all. If there's enough really unique things I missed, I could always just make another video.